unconscious human beings, emergence of knowledge, realization of death and suffering, and the elimination of the paradise, right? Okay, so now I'll read you the story of the Buddha. The father of Prince Gautama, the Buddha, savior of the Orient, determined to protect his son from desperate knowledge and tragic awareness, built for him an enclosed pavilion, a walled garden of earthly delights. Okay, so the story goes that an angel visited Buddha's father and said that he's going to have a son, and the son is either going to become the greatest ruler that the world has ever seen or a spiritual leader. And the father, being a practical man, thought, well, there's no bloody way. I want my son to be some like wandering spiritual leader. I want him to be the greatest king that the world has ever seen. Okay, and so the father decides, how am I going to get my son to be the greatest ruler the world has ever seen? I better get him to fall in love with the world, because then he's not going to go traipsing after some sort of half-witted spiritual knowledge. He's going to stick to practical tasks, right? That's something that a father should do to some degree, is orient you in the world, right? And maybe you shouldn't subvert your spiritual development to any great degree, but there's a practical element to this. And so anyways, that's how it works. And so that's what happens. The father builds this city of perfection, and he eliminates from it everything that's a reminder of the suffering that's associated with life. So the only thing that's allowed, the only creatures that are allowed to be in there, the only people that are allowed to be in there are healthy, young, and happy people. So the Buddha grows up surrounded by nothing but the positive elements of life. Well, you think, well, what does that mean? Well, it's akin to the paradise idea, obviously, walled enclosure of paradise where there's no death, but there's more to it than that too. It's also in some sense what a good father would do. What do you do with your young children? Well, you don't expose them to death and decay at every step of the way, right? You build a protected world for them, like a walled enclosure, and you only keep what's healthy and life-giving inside of it, and you don't expose them to things that they can't tolerate. You know, maybe you don't take a 3-year-old to a funeral. Now, maybe you do, but maybe you don't. There's things that you don't expect them to be able to cope with. You regulate what they're allowed to watch. You're not going to show them the Texas Chainsaw Massacre when they're 4 years old, right? So you're staving off knowledge of mortality and death. And so he's just being a good father in many ways here. All signs of decay and degeneration were thus kept hidden from the prince. Immersed in the immediate pleasures of the senses, in physical love, in dance and music and beauty and pleasure, Gautama grew to maturity, protected absolutely from the limitations of mortal being. However, he grew curious, despite his father's most particular attention and will, and resolved to leave his seductive prison. Well, it's that curiosity element. It's the same thing that lurks in the Adam and Eve story. It's like God tells Adam and Eve, see that tree over there? Don't be bothering with it. Well, you know what's going to happen with human beings, especially if there's a snake associated with it. They're going to be over there right away checking that place out. And that's exactly what happens with the Buddha. It's like he's raised to be healthy. And what's the consequence of that is that the fact that he's healthy makes him look for what's beyond the protected confines of the thing that made him healthy. It's like even in the Geppetto story, you know, where Geppetto paints on Pinocchio's mouth and he's ready to go. He puts him outside the next day and Pinocchio's ready to run away with all the kids, right? So the consequence of raising a child in a healthy way is that the child is going to be curious enough to go out there and look for some trouble. And we actually know that because there is follow-up studies of teenagers. You imagine that there's teenagers who never break any rules. And then there's teenagers who break all the rules, okay? These teenagers don't do very well. Introverted, depressed, anxious, depressed. Sorry, I said that twice. These ones are antisocial. The ones in the middle, that's what you want. You want your damn teenager to get out of the paradisal confines of your house and to go cause some trouble and to investigate. Maybe you don't want to know about it any more than you have to. You don't want them to be breaking rules all the time, and you don't want them to be so timid and oppressed that they can't make a move on their own and never make a mistake. So the paradoxical thing here, and it's sort of echoed, this is why I like these two stories back to back, is like, if you give people what they want, then the first thing they're going to do is try to get beyond it. And Dostoevsky says the same thing in Notes from Underground. He says if you gave people everything they wanted, pure utopia, so he says, so that they're sitting in a pool of bliss with nothing but bubbles of happiness coming up from the surface, and all they have to do is eat cake and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. Dostoevsky's observation is, the first thing that people would do is find something to smash that with, just so that something interesting and perverse could happen. It's like, well, yes, we're creatures that are designed to encounter the unknown. We want to keep moving beyond what we have, even if what we have is what we want. And maybe that's partly because we're oriented towards the future. We think, well, this is great, but it's not good enough. It's great, but it's not good enough. There's always something more that drives us forward. Well, so that's what happens with the Buddha. He gets curious. He sees the walls. He thinks, well, there's walls. There's probably something outside of those walls.